The Galactic Medical Consortium had, in its infinite wisdom and bureaucratic splendour, classified every sapient species according to their healing capabilities. At the top of this prestigious pyramid sat the crystalline healers, who could apparently mend bones with a gentle hum and realign organs through harmonic resonance. How wonderfully convenient! Just below them perched the psionic menders, capable of diagnosing ailments through telepathic scanning and treating trauma with pure mental energy. Impressive, if you enjoyed having alien thoughts rummaging through your cranium like an unwelcome houseguest. Then came the biokinetic surgeons, the quantum physicians, the nano healers, and roughly 47 other classifications of medical practitioners, each more sophisticated and condescending than the last. And there, languishing at the very bottom of this illustrious hierarchy, like yesterday's medical waste, sat the humans. Class C emergency responders. Class C. The designation practically dripped with disdain. It suggested that humans were barely qualified to apply bandages to scraped knees, much less handle anything requiring actual medical expertise. The official documentation described human medicine as primitive but occasionally useful for basic trauma stabilization. How generous of them! Beatrice Holt had memorized that particular insult, word for word, during her 3 years stationed at Outpost Epsilon 7, a remote research facility perched on the edge of civilized space like a cosmic afterthought. She'd been assigned here specifically because her human medical training was deemed adequate for treating the minor injuries that befell researchers who occasionally bumped into things or suffered paper cuts from alien documentation that was apparently sharper than Earth paper. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had been rejected from every major medical program on Earth, only to find herself practicing medicine among the stars, where her species was considered medically inept by default. The outpost itself reflected this hierarchy beautifully. The medical bay where B worked resembled a supply closet compared to the gleaming treatment centres reserved for the higher classification healers. Her equipment consisted primarily of archaic tools. Sutures, antiseptics, mechanical ventilators, and other devices that required actual physical interaction with patients. Meanwhile, Ambassador Helios, the resident crystalline healer, operated from a chamber filled with resonating crystals and harmonic generators that could supposedly cure anything from migraines to existential dread. Chief Medical Officer Orion, a psionic mender whose species looked like particularly judgmental jellyfish, had made it clear during B's orientation that humans were present primarily as backup for situations too mundane to warrant advanced intervention. Think of yourselves as medical janitors, he'd explained, with what might have been kindness if delivered by someone, with facial expressions. You handle the mess so we can focus on real medicine. How delightfully motivating. B's typical day began with reviewing incident reports that read like a comedy of errors. Yesterday's highlight included a researcher who'd somehow managed to get his tentacle caught in a door, requiring 15 minutes of careful extraction and a stern lecture about spatial awareness. Last week featured a visiting dignitary who'd suffered an allergic reaction to the station's artificial atmosphere, which B had treated with a simple antihistamine, while Ambassador Helios spent 2 hours preparing a harmonic cleansing ritual that ultimately proved unnecessary. The station's daily briefings provided endless entertainment in the form of warnings about local wildlife that everyone studiously ignored. Security Captain Nebula, whose species resembled armoured rhinoceroses with anger management issues, delivered these warnings with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. Reminder: the indigenous Shadowmoor population remains active in sectors 7 through 12, she'd announced that morning with her characteristic monotone. These apex predators measure approximately 4 meters in height, possess retractable claws capable of penetrating standard hull plating, and demonstrate pack hunting behaviours. Researchers are advised to maintain minimum safe distances of 2 kilometres from all sightings. The assembled scientists had nodded politely while mentally calculating whether they could finish their fieldwork before lunch. Nobody took the warning seriously, because nobody had actually encountered a Shadowmoor in the 3 years since the outpost's establishment. They had become like weather reports for perpetually sunny days. Technically important, but practically irrelevant. Bea had spent her morning treating a minor burn on a lab technician who'd touched something he shouldn't have, followed by dispensing pain medication to a researcher suffering from what humans would recognise as a hangover, but which his species dignified with the term neural processing overflow. Fascinating how universal some conditions prove to be, regardless of how many brains or stomachs a species possessed. The afternoon brought its usual parade of minor ailments and imaginary emergencies. A visiting dignitary convinced himself he was dying because his species' equivalent of hiccups had lasted more than their customary 30 seconds. Bea had cured him with a glass of water and a reassuring pat on whatever passed for his shoulder. Ambassador Helios had offered to perform a full harmonic analysis to identify potential underlying causes, but the dignitary had declined once he realised it would take 4 hours and require removing his clothes. As evening approached, Bea found herself cleaning her equipment and updating patient files, routine tasks that kept her hands busy while her mind wandered to more interesting possibilities. She'd studied xenobiology extensively, fascinated by the biological diversity represented among the consortium species, but her position relegated her to treating the alien equivalent of splinters and headaches. Through the medical bay's single window, she could see the station's perimeter illuminated by artificial lights that pushed back the gathering darkness of the alien world beyond. Somewhere out there, in that darkness, lived creatures that the advanced species feared enough to maintain 2-kilometre safety perimeters. Creatures that had never been studied up close, never been treated by any of the consortium's vaunted medical specialists. The irony struck her as she sealed the last of her supply containers. Here she was, classified as barely competent to treat minor injuries, surrounded by medical practitioners who could supposedly heal anything through crystals and telepathy. Yet none of them had ever actually tested their abilities against the real challenges this world presented. They'd built their hierarchy based on theory and controlled conditions, never venturing beyond the safety of their sterile treatment chambers. As if summoned by her thoughts, a distant sound echoed across the facility's grounds, deep, resonant, and undeniably alive. Bea paused in her cleaning, listening as the sound repeated. It came from somewhere beyond the perimeter lights, from the darkness where the Shadowmoors supposedly prowled. She'd heard recordings of their vocalizations during briefings, but this was different, closer, and carrying an unmistakable note of distress that her medically trained ear recognized despite never having heard it from this particular species. The sound came again, and this time Bea was certain she heard something else beneath it. the smaller, weaker cry of something young and in pain. Outside her window, the lights of the facility continued their eternal vigil against the darkness, while somewhere beyond their reach, something was calling for help in a language that transcended species barriers. Something that the galaxy's most advanced medical practitioners would never get close enough to understand. Bee smiled grimly as she finished her evening tasks, unaware that tomorrow would bring her an opportunity to discover just how inadequate the consortium's medical hierarchy really was. The emergency klaxons began their shrieking symphony at precisely 0347 hours, transforming the peaceful research facility into a cacophony of panic and flashing lights. Bee jolted awake in her quarters, muscle memory already pulling her toward her emergency kit before her brain fully processed what was happening. The automated announcement system, speaking in the overly calm voice that suggested imminent doom, began its litany of doom. Code Red. Perimeter breach detected. All personnel implement Emergency Protocol 7. Repeat. Code Red. Large predator presence confirmed within facility boundaries. How wonderfully specific. Large predator presence. The consortium's bureaucratic language managed to make a potentially lethal situation sound like a minor scheduling conflict. Bee threw on her medical gear and rushed toward the central corridor, where she encountered the galaxy's finest medical minds implementing Emergency Protocol 7 with remarkable efficiency, which is to say, they were running away as fast as their various appendages could carry them. Ambassador Helios swept past her in a glittering cascade of crystalline panic, his harmonic healing crystals chiming discordantly as he fled toward the emergency bunkers. Evacuation mandatory for all Class A and Class B medical personnel, he announced without breaking stride. Protocol dictates maximum safety preservation for essential healing resources. Chief Medical Officer Orion undulated past with impressive speed for a species that resembled sentient jelly, his telepathic abilities apparently useless for predicting his own terror. Human personnel maintained stations per safety guidelines, he projected mentally as he vanished around a corner. Class C designation includes expendability parameters. How reassuring. The galaxy's most advanced healers were abandoning ship, while the expendable human got to stay behind and presumably offer herself as an appetizer to whatever was causing the commotion. Coordinator Apex materialized beside her, their species' natural ability to phase between dimensions, allowing them to appear anywhere in moments of crisis. Unfortunately, they used this impressive capability primarily for delivering bad news. Field Medic Holt, you will maintain emergency medical readiness while advanced personnel implement safety protocols. You mean while everyone else hides in the bunkers? Safety protocols, Apex corrected with bureaucratic precision, then promptly phased away to join the evacuation. Bee found herself alone in the medical bay, surrounded by the abandoned equipment of species too sophisticated to risk actual danger. Through the bay's reinforced windows, she could see security lights casting stark shadows across the facility's grounds. Somewhere out there lurked whatever had triggered the alarms, while she stood equipped with nothing more advanced than her primitive human medical training and a stubborn refusal to abandon her post. The facility's external sensors painted a picture on her monitoring screen that made her breath catch. The creature approaching the medical bay was massive beyond the briefing's conservative estimates. 4 meters tall had been an understatement. This thing stood nearly 5 meters at the shoulder, with a sleek, muscular frame built for speed and power. Its dark fur seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the impression of a living shadow moving with fluid grace across the compound. A Shadowmaw, the apex predator that had kept every advanced species at a respectful 2-kilometer distance for 3 years. And it was walking directly towards her position with what appeared to be deliberate intent. Bee's medical training kicked in automatically, overriding the primal fear response that suggested immediate flight. The creature's gait was wrong. It moved with a pronounced limp, favouring its left side, and something about its posture suggested exhaustion rather than aggression. More importantly, it was carrying something. As the Shadowmaw approached the medical bay's external entrance, the facility's floodlights revealed what had brought it here. Cradled in its massive jaws, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a formidable predator, was a smaller version of itself. A cub, barely a quarter the size of its parent, hanging limply with obvious injuries. The adult Shadowmaw stopped just outside the medical bay's entrance and fixed its eyes directly on Bee through the reinforced transparisteel. Those eyes held an intelligence that the briefings had never mentioned, along with something unmistakably universal, the desperate plea of a parent whose child was dying. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Bee muttered, her professional assessment warring with self-preservation instincts. The cub was clearly in critical condition, its breathing shallow and laboured. Blood matted its fur along the left flank, and one of its small legs hung at an unnatural angle. Without immediate medical intervention, it would die. The parent Shadowmaw remained perfectly still, watching her with those intelligent eyes. It made no aggressive moves, issued no threatening sounds. It simply waited, having somehow identified the medical facility and brought its injured offspring to the one person still present to help. The absurdity of the situation struck her like a physical blow. The galaxy's most advanced medical practitioners had fled from the very opportunity they'd spent years theorizing about. Here was a chance to study and treat an indigenous species that had never been examined by any of their sophisticated techniques, and they'd all run away because their protocols prioritized their own safety over actual medical practice. Bee activated the external communication system, her voice echoing across the compound. "Easy there, big guy. I can see your little one is hurt. You brought him to the right place, but I need you to stay calm while I work." The Shadowmaw's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and incredibly, it seemed to understand. It gently lowered the cub to the ground just outside the entrance, then stepped back several meters. Its posture remained alert, but non-threatening, like a worried parent in a hospital waiting room. "Security override, medical emergency," Bee announced to the facility's automated systems. "Opening external access for emergency treatment." The computers protested with a series of warnings about unauthorized contact with hostile indigenous lifeforms, but her medical authority codes overrode the safety protocols that the advanced species had abandoned anyway. The entrance cycled open, and Bee stepped outside to face the most dangerous predator on the planet, armed with nothing more than her medical kit and 3 years of treating alien paper cuts. The irony wasn't lost on her that this was probably the most important medical case of her career, and she was handling it alone because everyone more qualified had deemed it too dangerous. The Shadowmaw cub was worse off than she'd initially assessed. Multiple lacerations across its torso suggested an encounter with something equally dangerous, possibly a territorial dispute with another predator. The broken leg was a compound fracture that would require immediate surgical intervention. Most critically, its breathing indicated possible internal injuries that could prove fatal without proper treatment. As she knelt beside the injured cub, the parent Shadowmoor moved closer, its massive form looming over her like a living mountain. Any sudden moves would probably result in her becoming a very brief footnote in xenobiological history, but the creature's behaviour suggested intelligence and restraint that the consortium's experts had never suspected. "Your boy's pretty banged up," she told the parent, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "But I think I can help him. You're going to have to trust me, though. Some of what I do might look scary, but it's all to help him heal." The Shadowmoor's response was a low, rumbling sound that held no threat. If anything, it sounded like acknowledgement, even gratitude. It settled into a watchful crouch nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to give her room to work. B activated her portable medical scanner, the primitive human device providing more useful information about the cub's condition than any of the abandoned crystalline analyzers or psionic assessment tools. The readings confirmed her initial diagnosis, serious but treatable, assuming she could perform surgery under the watchful eyes of a creature that could dismember her without effort. "Well," she murmured to herself as she prepared her equipment, "this is either going to be the greatest medical breakthrough in consortium history, or the shortest career in xenological medicine ever recorded." The parent Shadowmoor's eyes never left her as she began her work, but there was something in that steady gaze that transcended species barriers. It was the look of hope, desperate and fragile, that every parent wore when their child's life hung in the balance. Surgery under the stars had never been covered in B's medical training, particularly not with a 5-meter apex predator serving as her surgical assistant. The Shadowmoor parent had positioned itself to provide optimal lighting, its bioluminescent markings casting an ethereal glow over the makeshift operating area. How considerate of evolution to provide built-in surgical lighting. The cub's injuries were worse than her initial assessment suggested. The compound fracture was the least of her concerns now that she'd gotten a proper look at the internal damage. 3 broken ribs, probable internal bleeding, and what appeared to be a punctured lung. Ambassador Helios's harmonic crystals would have been utterly useless here, assuming he'd been brave enough to stick around and try. "All right, big guy," she addressed the parents while preparing her surgical instruments. "This is going to get messy. Your boy needs real surgery, not some fancy light show or telepathic hand-waving." The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to perform the most complex medical procedure of her career using techniques that the consortium classified as barbarically invasive. While the galaxy's finest healers cowered in their bunkers, she was going to save a life with old-fashioned human stubbornness and a scalpel. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she administered a local anaesthetic, grateful that basic pain management seemed universal across species. The cub's breathing steadied slightly as the medication took effect, and remarkably, the parent's tension seemed to ease as well. Perhaps it recognized the signs of medical intervention, or perhaps desperation had made it willing to trust anything that might help. The surgery itself became a delicate dance between her medical knowledge and educated guesswork about Shadowmoor physiology. Their bone structure was denser than human bone, but followed similar patterns. Their circulatory system used a copper-based blood analogue that responded well to standard coagulants. Most surprisingly, their nerve pathways showed remarkable similarities to Earth mammals, suggesting convergent evolution across vastly different worlds. As she worked, Bee found herself narrating the procedure to the parent, partly out of habit, and partly because the creature seemed to understand more than the briefings had suggested. "I'm going to repair this lung first, then work on the internal bleeding. The broken ribs will heal naturally once everything else is stabilised." The Shadowmoor's response was a low rumble that sounded almost like gratitude. It maintained its vigilant watch, but showed no signs of aggression, even when Bee had to make deeper incisions than initially planned. The trust being displayed by a creature that could easily kill her was both humbling and terrifying. Through the medical bay's windows, she could see the faces of her colleagues pressed against the reinforced glass of the emergency bunkers. They watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as she performed primitive surgery that their advanced techniques couldn't have replicated. Ambassador Helios would need hours to calibrate his crystals for a new species. Chief Medical Officer Orion's telepathic abilities were useless on a patient whose mental patterns he'd never encountered. But human medicine, with its emphasis on direct physical intervention, was proving adaptable in ways their theoretical superiority couldn't match. The cub's vital signs steadied as she completed the thoracic repairs and moved on to setting the broken leg. Standard orthopedic principles applied beautifully, and within an hour she had the fracture properly aligned and splintered. The young Shadowmoor's breathing had improved dramatically, and its colour was returning to normal. As she administered post-surgical medications, the parent moved closer, its massive head lowering to gently nuzzle its offspring. The cub responded with a weak but unmistakably healthy sound, and the parent's relief was palpable. "He's going to be fine," Bee told the parent, exhaustion finally hitting her as the adrenaline wore off. "Keep him quiet for a few days, and those injuries should heal completely." The Shadowmoor's response changed everything she thought she knew about interspecies communication, and everything the Consortium thought they knew about human medicine. The Galactic Medical Consortium's emergency session convened 3 days later, and the bureaucratic panic was absolutely delicious to witness. Consul Prime Vortex, whose species resembled judgmental praying mantises with administrative complexes, presided over a gathering of the galaxy's most distinguished medical minds as they grappled with a crisis that threatened their entire hierarchical worldview. "Field Medic Holt," Vortex began, his compound eyes reflecting the light from a dozen data tablets, "your unauthorized medical intervention has created complications." Complications was putting it mildly. The Shadowmoor family had returned twice since the surgery, bringing other injured members of their pack. Word had somehow spread among the indigenous species that the human possessed healing abilities, and the facility now regularly received visits from creatures that the Consortium had spent years avoiding. The medical bay's external area had been transformed into an impromptu veterinary clinic, with Bee treating everything from infected wounds to broken bones. The truly embarrassing part, from the Consortium's perspective, was that she was succeeding where their advanced techniques would have failed. Ambassador Helios's harmonic crystals couldn't calibrate for species they'd never studied. Chief Medical Officer Orion's telepathic healing required mental contact with familiar neural patterns. But human medicine, with its emphasis on understanding anatomy and physiology through direct observation and intervention, proved remarkably adaptable. The indigenous species appear to have designated you as their primary medical provider, Coordinator Apex reported, with barely concealed bewilderment. Our xenobiological department has documented 17 different species seeking your assistance. B suppressed a smile as she sat in the council chamber, surrounded by beings whose medical credentials supposedly dwarfed her own. The irony was exquisite. The Class C emergency responder had become the facility's most effective healer, simply by doing what humans had always done best: adapting, improvising, and refusing to give up when faced with the impossible. The consortium's medical classification system requires immediate revision, Ambassador Helios announced, his crystalline structure dimming with what might have been embarrassment. Human healing techniques demonstrate unexpected efficacy in xenobiological applications. The understatement of the millennium. B's barbaric surgical methods had achieved results that their sophisticated technologies couldn't replicate. Her willingness to physically interact with patients, rather than maintaining sterile distance through energy fields and remote manipulation, had proven crucial for treating species with unknown physiologies. Field Medic Holt will be reclassified as Class A Xenobiological Specialist, Consul Prime Vortex declared with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a tax audit. Human medical protocols will be integrated into standard consortium training. The assembled medical professionals received this news with varying degrees of shock and wounded pride. 3 years ago, they dismissed B as barely qualified to treat minor injuries. Now they were copying her techniques and requesting her guidance on cases their advanced methods couldn't handle. The final irony came 2 weeks later, when B found herself treating a crystalline healer who'd suffered what humans would recognize as kidney stones. Ambassador Helios lay on her examination table, his harmonic abilities useless against his own medical emergency, while she prepared the primitive ultrasonic equipment that would break up the crystalline formations causing his agony. "I must admit," he said, his voice losing its usual condescension, "human medicine possesses certain practical advantages that our theoretical models failed to account for." B smiled as she adjusted the ultrasonic frequency, watching through the window as a family of shadow Moors waited patiently for her to finish with her current patient. The galaxy's most advanced medical minds were finally learning what she'd known all along. Sometimes the best medicine wasn't the most sophisticated technology or the most elegant theory. Sometimes it was simply the willingness to get your hands dirty and help whoever needed healing, regardless of how many teeth they had. The transformation of Outpost Epsilon 7 became legendary throughout consortium space. What had once been a backwater research facility staffed by expendable personnel became the galaxy's premier centre for interspecies medical research. Delegations arrived weekly to observe Bay's revolutionary techniques, which were really just standard human medical practices applied with common sense and determination. The Shadowmoor Pack had become unofficial guardians of the facility, their presence ensuring that no hostile forces disturbed the medical operations. Young Shadowmoors would play in the compound's outer areas, while their parents brought injured pack members for treatment. the sight of apex predators queuing politely, for medical attention had become so routine that visiting dignitaries barely commented on it anymore. Chief Medical Officer Orion, once dismissive of human capabilities, now spent his days frantically taking notes as B worked. His telepathic species had developed an entire academic discipline around studying her decision-making processes, trying to understand how primitive intuition could consistently outperform their calculated analytical methods. The truly delicious part was watching the consortium's medical establishment scramble to rewrite centuries of established doctrine. Suddenly, hands-on intervention became a respected field of study rather than a barbaric practice. Medical schools across the galaxy began offering courses in human-style emergency response, teaching alien students to overcome their species' natural aversion to physical contact with patients. Security Captain Nebula had been forced to expand the facility's medical wing 3 times to accommodate the constant stream of indigenous patients. Her daily briefings now included updates on which species were scheduled for treatment, rather than warnings about maintaining safe distances. The irony of an outpost originally designed to study dangerous wildlife from afar, becoming a thriving interspecies medical centre, wasn't lost on anyone with half a brain.